I suppose, as they would expect, I do have two things to say. But look, wonderful to see you all here. But I must begin by saying I'm sorry that you have to be here. And it seems extraordinary, doesn't it, that we have to be protesting in the front of the National Parliament to defend property rights. I actually thought that people went to war to ensure that those sorts of rights were secure for us for all time. Can I thank on behalf of thousands who can't be here, the farmers who have come here today. It is a simple protest, but of course there are some people in this side, the building behind us, who don't seem to understand the Queen's English. Because this is a simple protest, as you know, about the erosion of property rights. I'm just wondering which of those words the Rudd government doesn't understand. The issue, and forgive me for saying something of the obvious, but at the same time it is important that some of these issues are on the record for our being here today. And we are talking about state and federal environmental regulations which are undermining your rights and the rights of property owners across the country. In New South Wales, there are at least a dozen state government statutes and regulations that take away landowners' rights to use their property. And a recent report by the Institute of Public Affairs argued that those statutes and regulations alone run to 700 pages. If we cut to the chase, what people like Peter Spencer, who's with us here today, are doing, stuck up a tree, is simply demanding compensation for the reduction in the value of farming land, a reduction brought about by government regulations. If landowners don't have a basic right to their property after they've forked out money to buy it, it's valid to ask, what rights do they have? Private property rights are human rights just as much as freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And property owners should be compensated when they're stopped from using their land as they choose to use it. And if reported comments from the Federal Minister for Finance and Deregulation, Lindsay Tanner, are true, that the Commonwealth would face massive expense if we compensated farmers, if those comments are true, the answer is, well, hang the expense, compensate them. The alternative, of course, is to steal from them. And that's currently what is happening. It's taken a long time, of course, to get here because farmers, and my old man was a farmer, most probably not as successful as some of yours, but farmers are long-suffering and they endure. They're not given to protesting and to marching and to standing up because they're too damn busy. They're too damn busy. And they've got other things to do. But for years in New South Wales, farmers are having to navigate their way around the Native Vegetation Act of 2003, the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act of 1979, the Plantations and Reforestation Act of 1999, the National Parks and Wildlife Act of 1974, the Forestry Act of 1916, the Forestry and National Park Estate Act of 1998, just so that we get this on the record, the Threatened Species Conservation Act of 1995, tree preservation orders, irrigation orders, water entitlements, state environmental planning policy, SEP 14 for coastal wetlands, SEP 19 for bushland in urban areas, SEP 26 for littoral rainforests, SEP 44 for koala habitat protection, and at that point I got knocked up. If property rights have been confiscated by the state for whatever reason, the owners of that property should be compensated. And if, as is the case in New South Wales, constitutions don't provide for that, then the constitutions should be amended. In Peter Spencer's case, state laws restricting the clearing of native vegetation helped make his land unviable. But the same story can be told of land taken from farmers for mining, land taken from citrus growers for similar purposes, or indeed water rights taken from farmers for which they have paid, for which they are not compensated. Peter Spencer became a symbol of all this simply because he faced the problem that everybody faces in those circumstances. He couldn't meet his mortgage repayments. His sister and brother-in-law took over the debt from the bank. Peter Spencer has been unable to repay them, and so the next step is the sheriff arrives to arrange a forced sale of your property. A family tragedy? Yes. A personal tragedy? Yes. A political scandal? Certainly. In 2004, the Productivity Commission produced a report on the impact of native vegetation laws. And the Productivity Commission found that farmers had lost income, their properties had been devalued, and they had received very little or no compensation. It suits the government, the federal government and the Rudd government and others to trot out these Productivity Commission reports when it suits them. When it doesn't suit them, they become doorstops. The worst affected, the Productivity Commission said, quote, these are farmers, often suffered serious personal stress in the face of the resultant marginal viability or even loss of their property, the Productivity Commission. Now, Peter Spencer's just an ordinary bloke like everybody else who had a dream to return from a fairly successful career, at that point working in Papua New Guinea. He wanted to return to New South Wales and become a farmer. He bought land not far from here, as you know, at Shannon's Flat. It took him a while, 15 years, to put together a holding that was big enough to build a house. He finished up with almost 6,000 hectares, of which 60% was cleared. He wanted to keep the other 40% uncleared. But in the mid-1990s, he was hired by the office of the Papua New Guinea Prime Minister, and he was away from his farm for some time. The details of that don't matter. When he returned to spend the rest of his life as a farmer, he found that he'd have to clear the saplings that had grown over much of his previously cleared land. Except clearing bans had been put in place. Basically, his farm had been converted into a vast nature reserve. Land clearing regulations rendered his property unviable. He complained, no one wanted to listen. There are no votes in the bush. Half the people that you complain to have never been to the bush.